Great. Well, I want to welcome everybody to my fourth Tuesday Revolutionize Your Retirement Interview with Expert series. I'm Dori Mintzer, owner of Revolutionize Retirement, and your host today. And we're starting off 2026 with a wonderful, wonderful speaker. For those of you, just real quickly, for those of you new to the program, we're now using Zoom platform, as you see. We have the chat feature, so hopefully you will ask questions that will integrate throughout the call. And all of you who have signed up will get a recording link after the call. And within the not too distant future, this interview will also be part of a podcast, so it'll have wider reach to people. Sign up actually for the upcoming ones can be any time now. If you go to www.revolutionizeretirement.com, with this new format that we have, you can sign up ahead of time, so you don't have to wait until the week before. So you'll see that right at the moment we're scheduled through June, and hopefully you will sign up and more are going to be added to the list. So I am just delighted everybody's here. And I know the weather in this country has, for much of the country, has been very difficult. We've had almost 2 feet of snow here, and it's brutally cold. And I think that you're in New York, as Dr. Freed, so that you've probably had a similar situation. So without further ado, I want to introduce our really esteemed and wonderful guest, Dr. Linda Freed. Dr. Freed has her MD and PhD. She's a global leader in, never say this right, epidemiology. Oh, I got it. Epidemiology, geriatrics, and the science of healthy aging. She's devoted her distinguished career to reimagining aging as a powerful asset for individuals and for society. She's director of the Robert N. Butler Columbia Aging Center, Dean Emerita of the Mailman School of Public Health, and a professor of epidemiology and medicine at Columbia University. And currently, Dr. Freed is on sabbatical, and I am so delighted that you've, agreed to join us for sabbatical. And I love the title that you came up with. Could older people be the cavalry coming over the hill? And I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Freed when she was in Boston doing a TEDx talk. And then we spoke the other day. And so I am so delighted. Welcome, 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 welcome. And let's start, if you will, with just what got you interested in this field of longevity and gerontology. I think that might be a good place to start. And then let's really talk about, your notions about older people and this important time we are in society of looking at what older people can bring to all of us.
Well, thank you, Dorian. And it's really a pleasure to be here and to have a chance, I hope, in part of this, to really have a conversation among all of us and to get
Right?
your input. So I'll try and answer your first question, which is what got me into this.
Mhm.
I think that was the question.
Right.
I was a uh, junior faculty member in 1985. I had just taken a job as an internist and health researcher at Johns Hopkins, just starting out. I was very excited about what I was doing. And a guy who was the chief of the new division of geriatric medicine, who I'd gotten to know, and we were doing a little project together, came into my office one day and said that he wanted to recruit me to become a geriatrician. Now, I'm sure many of you know about physician training, and I had already been through a lot of it. And and I liked and admired the person who said that to me, but really I wasn't interested. And I wanted to do what I had taken a faculty position to do. So I told him that. And I said, no, thank you. And he left. But because I actually admired him so much, I thought, well, I wonder what this is all about. So this was very early days of the internet, but I went on the internet and looked at the data, and the data I just had not been aware of. It took my breath away. It still does.
Mm,
I realized so I was a physician taking care of young men mostly who were dying of HIV/AIDS in our hospitals.
mm,
This was long before we had a treatment or prevention. Um, and we were, the hospitals were drowning in trying to provide the care that was needed for something that was unprecedented. And I looked at the data about longevity and aging, and it took my breath away because I just hadn't realized that we had extended life expectancy so dramatically in the 20th century. So we'd gone from, in 1900, average life expectancy at birth, so the average length of lives that people could expect to live was 47 years in 1900. And if you were African American in this country, it was 36 years.
mm,
And then I looked, so this was 1985. I looked at what had happened, and at that point, we had extended life expectancy from overall 47 years to, at that point, about 72 years. That was astounding. And it had just quietly happened, but it had happened as a result of intentional interventions, particularly public health interventions that had prevented illness and mortality, had enabled children to survive childhood, women to survive childbirth, prevented the spread of infectious diseases so people didn't get sick. And then other things as well. Uh, that is primarily what had extended our life expectancy, but that we had added at that time 25 years and now 30
mm,
years to human life expectancy took my breath away. And then I thought about what the narrative was about this. And there was an emerging narrative, which I kept reading in the newspaper then. It's going to sound familiar to everybody here because it's still in the newspaper. We can't afford all these old people. What have we created? We've created a disaster. What will we do? Social Security will go broke. We can't afford Medicare, et cetera, et cetera. And all these old people are dependents who contribute nothing to society. Um, there were even people saying we should just push all these old people over a cliff, essentially. And I looked at that and I thought, well, this is a little bit nuts. We've just accomplished um, something extraordinary that we wanted young people to be able to live long lives, that we've now created that and we're actually starting to experience it. And the public narrative is to declare this a disaster before we've even interrogated whether it is or not. So I said that as a scientist because I saw nothing in the literature asking whether it could be great. And it seemed to me, that we were talking not just about our own lives, but we were talking about many people we love, our parents, our grandparents, our kids, and what the value of their longer lives will be. And it seemed to me that we needed to ask the question about whether there was um, unexpected, unanticipated, unarticulated value to being
mm,
able to live a long life? And could it be of net value to society in the way nobody seemed to be imagining? So I got so caught up and on these questions, and it seemed to me that in some ways, so this was 1985 to
yeah.
1986. It seemed to me that these were the questions that we are going to have to confront in the 21st century, when in fact the population became increasingly older. And so, how I got into this, the next day I changed my career. Told my colleague that I was in,
Oh, oh,
went back and
oh,
got training as a geriatrician, and
wow.
have been
Oh.
trying to answer this set of questions ever since. So I hope that wasn't too long-winded an answer.
No, and
That-
I think I'm so glad, and I think the world is that you made that decision because you've contributed so much. So
Thank you.
onward, share some of what you've learned about this changing demographic and the potential, because I think that's so much of it.
Well, yeah, so first of all, just to stay with the data for a sec, the US is about to have, because of our longer lives, the proportion of us who are older is increasing in our population. That's not a surprise. If you get more and more people
Right?
living longer, then the proportion changes. And we are about at we're at two inflection points. One is that the US is about to have 20% of the population over 65. And the other is that 2 years ago, we passed an inflection point for the first time in history where there are as many people 65 and older as there are young people under 15. That's
Mm,
astounding. We have
right.
never had that before. Now, this is happening around the world, where we're evolving in a very predictable fashion to having equal proportions in every age group.
That is amazing. Yeah.
And the next stage, which the US is not at because it's not at the head of this pack, the next stage is what countries in Asia and Europe are already experiencing, and other countries will, is that after have equal proportions in every age group,
Mm,
old, middle-aged, young adults, and children, what happens is what we're seeing is that there's a very predictable transition for a lot of reasons, which probably don't have time to go into, where young people around the world in highly developed countries are electing to have fewer children. And you probably are seeing the reports from China and South Korea and Japan and Singapore about big worries, and Italy, big worries about not about their population shrinking because young people are not having children or are not having more than one child, and that they will not be able to maintain their productivity as a
mm.
and their economic
Gotcha.
wealth as nations. Um, they're drawing conclusions that as to what the solutions would be that I don't think are appropriate, and the evidence is won't be effective. Um, and so I'm happy to talk about that more, but it's not the point of this discussion. But it won't be effective. There's lots of evidence to support that
Right.
incenting young women to have more children and paying for their IVF is not going to do it.
Right.
Um, so then the question is, we are inevitably, the success we have is one inevitably that our children and grandchildren are going to have long lives. That's a victory. That's wonderful.
Right.
But how do we plan for a society in which older age is an age of societal and personal meaning and value, which is not the current perception, and in which older people who have aspirations for contributions or engagement they want to have the opportunities to join, to do so. And so I think and how do we figure out what the accurate narrative is here? And if it is one we want to invest in, how do we change the general narrative? So, what I can tell you, because we've learned a lot since then, um, there was first, we've learned a lot on what older people say they want, and I'm one of them, one of us, maybe. Uh,
One of us. I would say that on this call, it's one of us. And
yeah,
and just to comment too, it's most as I look at who's here, we have predominantly people from this country, but they're people from Brazil and Uganda, and people
wonderful.
can actually, if you want, a few people have said where you're from. But just to know that you're speaking to a kind of global audience here, and
That's fabulous.
yeah.
And knowing that, I would say that every country of the world, except a few that are war-torn, are going through this very predictable and desirable demographic progression. And so, how we prepare for that to find the opportunities and to build them for individuals and for society is the question ahead of us. So, what can I tell you about what individual older people want? Well, there have been a few studies about that. The most recent one I'm aware of came from the McKinsey Health Institute 3 years ago, and this was a global study across 21 countries, asking about what older people want broadly and what they want that actually matters to their overall health and well-being. In general, what older people want is to be independent and age in place, avoid being a burden, and maintain relationships. But specifically, what they want is, and very of above average importance across these 21 countries, is that older people want to have some purpose in life. They want to have opportunities to participate in formal learning and continuing education, to learn new skills, to contribute through service or volunteering when they're able, to feel that their perspective as an older adult is valued and that they're a respected part of the community and that they are able to participate in activities and organizations of their community and make a contribution, as well as how they contribute to their family. Now, this is actually interestingly quite consistent with a US specific study 20 years before. So that would suggest, at least in the US, that this is not a moment in time perception, that there's some consistency of people's feelings over a couple cohorts of older people. Although in the 2004 study, which asked some additional questions, people also emphasized that they don't want to feel lonely or isolated, that they want to be able to work in paid activities or volunteer activities after their usual retirement age, and be able to act according to one's own inner standards and values. So, this is a state of our understanding at a population level about what people want. Um, Last week, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal. I don't know if anybody saw it. And the title of it was The Retirement Crisis No One Warns You About, mattering. And the Wall Street Journal reported on a 2020 article in healthcare that found that from over 3,000 retirees, people feel less valued, needed, or connected, and that this is a predictor of post-retirement depression. And that what erodes in retirement is a sense of mattering, the deep, and I quote here, the deep human need to feel valued and to have a chance to add value to the world. Um, so this is some background. So how do we understand that? Well, the dominant policy understanding of us as older adults is expressed in what's called the old age dependency ratio, which you see reported in the paper periodically that countries like Italy can't afford their old age dependency ratio, which is the number of older adults in the population compared to the number who are generally 18 to 64 years of age, who are pre presumably the working age population, who are creating societal value. That's the narrative that older people are dependent and non-contributory to societal well-being and good. But the data don't support that. First of all, many people who are of working age aren't working for a variety of reasons. And many people, a large proportion, certainly in the United States, who are of quote unquote retirement age, 65 and older, are working. And there's an increasing proportion to about now 15 to 20% of older adults who are working full or part-time, and many need to be working. But in their working, they're contributing to the economy. And there's a lot of concern in countries like Uganda and Brazil that that if older adults are working, they're taking jobs away from young people. But in fact, the data are exactly the opposite. That theory has been debunked by economists. And what's become clear is that older people and young people don't compete for the same jobs. And that if more older people are working, the economy gets stronger, and that builds new entry-level jobs for young people. So,
Oh,
in
that's
fact, older
interesting.
people who want to be working, can work, are strengthening the economy in ways that actually benefit young people. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind. But in addition, in the US, certainly, and I cite the US because we have some data on that, about a fifth, some people say a third of older people around the country volunteer in a variety of capacities in community organizations, national organizations, religious organizations, civic organizations to contribute to the collective well-being. And people who are not volunteering in a study that I did a few years ago, so many of them said they would like to, but the challenge is either that they are disabled from chronic illnesses and are not able to do it, or that they can't find roles in which they feel
Sure.
like they're making a difference or in which they're wanted. And both of those were of equal measure.
Mhm.
Dorian, you looked like you wanted to comment on something.
Well, no, I think it's so important to realize. I mean, I'm just the whole notion of mattering and that whole and not being invisible and the generational interconnectedness that's so important. And there are so many wonderful programs out there. I know El, Eldera that I interviewed, Donna, who I know you were
Yeah.
a mentor to, and I'm a mentor to also in a different
Oh,
way.
good.
But and co-generate. I mean, there are so many different ways of being involved, but I think you're speaking to something that's so important is, once you're not working or not working in the same way, there is that sense of being irrelevant, and society plays into that with the
Right.
ageism that we have. I mean, that's the other piece of it
Absolutely.
too.
So the
Yeah.
narrative, we bump up against two things. If this is really what I've shared thus far, expresses um, the what people are seeking, the obstacles we run up against are certainly the ageist narrative that older people don't bring capabilities or assets of value. And I'll get back to that in a minute. And the narrative that we old people are all dependent and non-contributory,
Right.
which I hope I've addressed a little bit. And then this is amplified by age segregation, certainly in the US.
Mm,
The US is now the most age segregated society in the history of the world
wow.
and immensely age segregated compared to what we used to be. So the generations don't know each other.
Mm,
And therefore, these tropes that I just went through are the dominant understanding that people have of who older people are. Now, ageist tropes go the other way about young people. And that's not accurate either.
Mhm.
So let's talk about what is accurate. So I've already told you that older people contribute a lot. In fact, there was an article in a journal called Day Economist by a wonderful economist, David Bloom, a couple of years ago, in which he estimated the value of contributions by older adults um, to society, looking at the economic contributions through working for pay
Mhm.
and the non-monetary contributions, which he estimated as their economic value through volunteering. And if you add those together, even at the present time, when we have limited volunteering opportunities for older people, he estimated that the value contributed by older adults in the US was equivalent to 7% of the US GDP.
Wow. Mhm.
Now, the other obstacle to people being engaged in ways that they want to, well, there are several obstacles. But a big one is that um, we don't have roles of meaning, purpose, and impact in general
Right.
for older people and that value older volunteers. I'll give you a story that I learned from a patient many years ago, like in the mid 80s, that
Mhm.
got me thinking about this. I had a number of patients with similar stories, but this gentleman was the first one I heard it from. He was a man in his late 60s who had just retired from being the CEO of a corporation, a big corporation. And he had been retired for about 3 months, and he got sick, and he really was sick. But and he came to see me for an evaluation in in a geriatric assessment center that I ran. And there was nothing clearly physically wrong with him, but he felt terrible and had been feeling terrible. And what became clear was that he was sick from not having a meaningful reason to get up in the morning. And he was sick from having gone from being on top of the world as the CEO to being invisible to everybody as a retired person. And so, on the spur of the moment, I wrote him a prescription to go out and speak to an organization that he valued and volunteer there, and then report back to me. And he came back 2 months later, maybe less, and he said he had gone to an organization that he cared about. He had volunteered, and they put him in a corner with a role, which was to lick stamps and put them on
Ah.
envelopes to
Mhm.
mail letters to people that the organization worked with. Nobody had found out his background, and they had just assumed he was an old person who could only do that. So, needless to say, he didn't stay because he had a lot of assets in the world that
Yeah.
nobody was willing to interested in deploying, and that is a huge problem in the volunteering options available to older people. So I'll talk about two other things, and then I'd like to open this up for discussion. And the first thing I'd like to talk about is what science now is telling us about the capabilities and assets that we accrue as we get older, the capabilities of maturity, and what moves us.
Mhm.
And of course, everything I'm about to tell you doesn't apply to everybody, but on average, there are prominent exceptions to every rule. But on average, in general, first of all, as we get older, we actually accrue a lot of knowledge and expertise over the course of our lifetime. And that does not disappear at any particular birthday or any birthday. We maintain that expertise through our lives as long as we don't become seriously cognitively impaired or develop dementia. Um, so we have a huge amount of expertise. Um, Older people with that expertise or just life experience have spent a lifetime solving problems. small problems, vexing problems, big problems. And in the course of solving those problems, develop a lot of experience and knowledge about how to solve a problem and how to decide that a problem's worth solving. And in fact, it turns out that as people get older, all of that experience in problem solving and related experience appear, the science is very early, to actually create new cognitive capabilities that we didn't have when we were younger. Capabilities for analysis of complex situations, capabilities to unite that with our values and judgment about whether something is worth solving, whether it's important, and capabilities of breaking down a complex problem into its component actionable parts to see um, what the series of solutions would need to be. And then and actually scientists are beginning to describe those new thought capabilities that people accrue as they get older in this experience. The other thing that people accrue as they get older is patience. If something matters, people understand how to be both patient for the long haul of getting something done that deeply matters. It doesn't have to be done tomorrow. It may take a few years, but also bring to the problem impatience. If the problem really matters, let's get going
Mhm.
and let's not waste this opportunity. Now, those are on the cognitive and value judgment side. Go ahead, Dorian.
No, I was just going to say, I see this. I mean, I think many people on the call who are people who, from their own experience, but also if they're still working or coaches or in education,
Oh,
you know, there's so much wisdom and resilience and that growth mindset and all of these things you're describing. But it's so hard if there's internalized ageism, where you don't believe in yourself and you're sort of against your future self, but also we just don't seem to have the infrastructure in our society, at least in
very
this
important.
country,
We do
that,
not,
yeah.
we don't have the infrastructure. So I want to add a few other capabilities and assets that
Right.
we develop because the infrastructure we need is one that values
Yeah.
the capabilities we develop as we get older. The other thing that you just described in terms of pa patience could be, I would say that if I um, add in one other thing, it's that as people well, I'll add in several things. One, as people get older, in general, not everybody, but in general, people become more pro-social,
Mhm.
more concerned about the well-being of others, more concerned about the future of our children, grandchildren, and all children and grandchildren. We become more generous by a
Mhm.
variety of measures as we get older, united with those pro-social goals. And we have a number of assets which really other generations, other age groups don't have as well. One is that because we've lived a life of seeing black, white, and gray,
Right.
and know that many dimensions of life are gray zones where there isn't a perfect answer. That combined with our pro-social goals and generosity seems to, and the wisdom that you're talking about, which all of these contribute to.
Right.
Older adults turn out to be much better at conflict mediation and
Mhm.
resolution than younger people are, able to take the perspectives of both sides of a conflict. And through their problem-solving capabilities to see how to optimize a solution for both sides. And there's very interesting evidence on that. The other thing that was reported a couple of years ago, which I think is really important, is that there's a study reported 3 years ago of older adults and young people who have been living for decades in intractable conflicts. The study reported on the perspectives of old and young on whether there was hope for a resolution. The countries where these intractable conflicts and the attitudes of old and young were studied was in Cyprus, studying Greek and Turkish Cypriots, both old and young, and in Israel, studying Jewish and Palestinian Israelis. What did they find? Well, the older adults and the young adults, which were much more like their the other groups in their age than they were like the young people in in their identity in terms of hope.
Mhm.
The young people who had lived through a couple of decades of intractable conflict in general saw no hope for a positive resolution and became disaffected and even had a tendency
Mhm.
to dehumanize the opposing group.
Mhm.
The older people consistently across all four groups maintained hope of a positive resolution.
Mhm.
Why did they do that? Well, the authors concluded that it was because they had lived long enough to have
Mhm.
seen moments of improvement
Mhm.
and knew that things could change, that new leaders could come in, that something cosmic could happen that wasn't really cosmic, that could change the opportunity for resolution. And they maintained hope for that.
Mhm.
And the article called for the hopefulness of older people to
Mhm.
help support young people having hope. The
It's
other assets,
so, I just want to stay with that a minute. I mean, that just seems so important to underscore, and particularly what's going on in our country right now. But this whole hope and sort of ties into legacy, it seems to me too, of this and the letting go of ego, and just wanting the future to be better, for
right, and seeing that things can be changed by human
that's
agency.
yeah.
So that goes along with the work by Laura Carstensen and others, which has shown that actually, as people get older, they become more balanced and emotionally, less likely to see things as a disaster. If things are relatively stable, if things really are a disaster, they're more susceptible to that than younger people. But But older people bring more emotional balance to a situation, are more able to tolerate ups and downs. And in general, everything I just described rolls up to being components of what you said before, Dorian, which is this aggregate concept of wisdom, which is added to by one last thing I'll mention, which is that many scholars of human development, starting perhaps with Eric and Joan Erickson, have described that as people get older, they have a felt need and a motivation to leave the world better than they found it, knowing that we're not immortal, that our life is going to end at some point, and that part of a feeling of having a life well lived is to feel what they described as generative, that you've left the world better than you found it in some way that brings you some resolution of
Yeah.
uh, that need. So think about all the immensely positive things I've described that we have never had in a fifth of our population before. In 1900, older people were 4% of the population and generally in good health. Now we have 20% of the population with a potential for these capabilities and assets and in increasingly good health. So, how could this matter?
Could it
And
not matter? But, but go ahead.
well, And should we try and together make it matter? What would that mean? What should we do with that? I have, since the late 80s, I've been focused on that question in a lot of ways because it was very clear that we did not have roles and opportunities for older people to contribute and didn't value what they could bring to the table. And at that point, didn't even know what they could bring to the table. Now we have enough insight to say, what could a fifth of the population having these assets mean, and how should that be deployed? Now, there are a lot of people now thinking about that, and I'd like to roll you all into the conversation and just mention that in the starting in the mid 90s, having worked on this for a while, I designed what was at the time, it still is, the first attempt to see if we could build a new societal institution, new social infrastructure to deploy these assets of all of us as older people in a way that could be transformative for society. And I built one role. It was a starter, but there could be many roles. And that role I judged to be both feasible at the time in the mid 90s and critically important to the future of a democracy, which is to assure that all children in public elementary schools were succeeding by third grade, because if they're not, they're tracked to drop out. And because public education, since the founders of this country, was deemed the basis of a successful democracy. This program called Experience Corps, we have demonstrated over the years, it's very carefully designed to utilize the assets that older people bring to support the success of our next generation of older people through their lives. And it works. And what it does as designed is to create the success of young people, to support the strengthening of a critical social and societal institution, which is public education, to roll out to building social capital of older people in their communities. And and then it's designed secretly as a public health program to strengthen the health of older people, starting with having opportunities for generative roles, and hidden inside those roles, physical, cognitive, and social activities, which are health producing. But that's still the only model of intentionally created social institution for an aging society. So
How
what,
much is it being used? Oh, no, go ahead. I don't want to interrupt
oh,
you.
I wanted to go to some questions, but to answer your question, unfortunately and unfortunately, it was in um, 10 years ago, it was in about 23 US cities and was taken over by ARP. And unfortunately, ARP has been making it smaller and smaller, not bigger and bigger. So it's a question on my mind at the moment as to whether we need to um, rethink and redeploy this model and how we might do that for the current world we're in. But I'd really, and I know we have only about 12 minutes or so, but I'd love to hear from you all about whether what I'm saying resonates with you, what you think would matter for ourselves as individuals as we get older, but also for society. How could society
But
benefit from being an aging society? So I turn it
I
over
think
to
we
you.
might be use chat to, maybe. I think I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
No, I was turning it over to you.
Oh, okay. Well, I want to invite people to use chat and we can, integrate some of what you say as we're discussing this. I think society has such a far way to go. I also love as people are submitting some of their responses. I know during your sabbatical, you've just been in Japan and in Singapore, and I just wondered if there's some new thoughts and insights. I mean, are there examples of other places, countries that, have created, whether it be things like experience core or other infrastructure that we can learn from,
Yeah.
um, in
So
our
maybe
country?
while people are writing in the chat, I'll say, first of all, I didn't mention that um, from 2018 to 2022, I chaired the U.S. National Academy of Medicine's Global Commission to create a global roadmap for healthy longevity. And that was issued in 2022. You can find the report on the website of the U.S. National Academy of Medicine, free to download. It has had a lot of global uptake, minimal US uptake. But what we tried to lay out in this global commission was really how every country in the world would benefit from preparing to be an aging society, including the things I've been talking about today, and including how to invest in people's health across the life course so people arrive at old age healthy and can stay healthy, which we now know is possible, and what that unleashes. So I recommend that. What I can say is that countries like Singapore and Japan have done what the Prime Minister of Singapore said, which is we're implementing this cover to cover. And in fact, I am working with the government of Singapore to do just that. But I see things popping up on chat, and Dorian, should we go to that?
Yep, um, I'm having a little trouble accessing some of these things, but Mary says Carl Jung suggested that purpose of old age is to increase our levels of consciousness, and that this is an evolutionary opportunity. If we each raise our own consciousness, it ripples out. What do you think of the purpose of old age being increasing our consciousness?
I would say it sounds good to me. And then, although, since Jung, there's been this interesting evidence that people accrue these capabilities, which may be part of increasing our consciousness. Um, and the question now is, how do we make it matter? I think, as well as support that. Interestingly, there's a faculty member at the University of Southern California who says that it's possible to train people to be wise, or at least wiser. And he's developing that kind of training. That might be another approach to that.
Very
I,
interesting to think about. We can learn empathy. I mean, people used to say we couldn't. So wisdom is, but some of it is really noticing and maybe incorporating experiences that we sometimes don't pay attention to, or skills or strengths that we have that we don't pay attention to. So it sort of makes sense to me that we could become wise, wiser.
so I see a comment from
Yeah.
Elaine that
So
she'd
Elaine,
like
yeah,
to
go
see
ahead.
more models like experience score. I completely agree with you. That is one role which we've learned enough we could build out even better now. But there are many roles being experimented with. I certainly believe that older people could take on being the leading the charge on climate change mitigation and prevention. Um,
Well,
I
and
think
Elaine mentions, actually, just to
right. She
add
said
that for a
Safe
minute.
Act for 60 plus people. I think that's so important because if I look at the young people, many of whom I teach, they are so depressed about the state of the world generally, but about what climate change portends. And they feel abandoned by older people because they don't know how much older people have tried and are trying to work on this. And so older people joining organizations like that will up or intergenerational ones, I think are needed to uplift the hopefulness of young people.
No, absolutely. And there's also, I'm just blocking the name right now, but Elders for Social Justice, as well as Elders for Climate Change, through they initially were Saging International, but I think they're offshoots, and so many communities have chapters of them, to become involved.
Well, I would love it if you would enter into the chat. What are the roles for older adults that you would like to see? And I'll throw in one, which is, should every older adult in this country be trained to teach civics lessons to young people at this moment in history about what creates a democracy and how we can strengthen it? So I'd
Well,
love.
people are adding that. We'll bring that up, but I would encourage you, what roles, what Dr. Fried was just saying, what roles do you see for older people? I would put a role, it may see, it's from Saging, but I really like the concept of elder, not elderine, but elder with the notion of really using our wisdom and not being afraid of interacting with younger and learning from them, but also knowing we have a lot to share. Um,
I see on Experience Corps, I see a comment from Mary Scott. You were exactly right. AmeriCorps has basically been defunded, and AmeriCorps was funding a lot of Experience Corps. This is a moment when I think personally that Experience Corps, a wide range of Experience Corps models with different roles, should be in every community in the US, not disappeared. And so, how we stand this up for the future is an open question. There's also a comment from Shella Turpin-Forster about cogenerate, which is also really important. How do we bring old and young together to to bring forward and enact solutions that are intergenerational? I think young people need this a lot and older people need it. And I often think that while middle-aged people are in charge of policy decisions, if the young and old ganged up on them, maybe we would have some more power.
um, let's see. Rhonda says, I think older people can do the same thing that youngers are doing. Think about AI. It's somewhat of a level playing field. They're learning, older adults are learning, and when an older adult learns, this opens up opportunities that might not exist elsewhere.
I think that
Um,
sounds great. And you
and also,
mentioned Eldira, Dorian, and Eldira is an elegant online model, which is very much powered by um, AI for good.
right. Yeah. And I encourage people, if you go to my podcast series, you can scroll down to the interview I did with Donna Griffin on Eldera, but it matches older people with younger around not tutoring subjects. So it's not teaching the civics that you're talking about that I think we need, but it's relationship building and storytelling. But also somebody, Mary from Minnesota says, she lives in Minnesota, and retired people have played a huge role in recent demonstrations.
Yeah. So
And
there's a question from Elaine. The model of Experience Corps that we created does in fact teach how to teach reading. And I think that's very much missing, as you said, for most tutoring programs. But we worked very carefully with early childhood educators to develop training, as you're suggesting, for older adults who don't have that background and who are volunteers. They're not teachers in the classroom. Um, but it works, I'm happy to say.
do you have any sense on what role maybe people listening to this, can do to try to get more funding or more exposure of things like Experience Corps, getting that or other things off the ground, or even finding ways to teach civics. I mean, any thoughts on how to mobilize even listeners here? I always like the take action part. Um,
Right. So I'm on sabbatical, as you mentioned, and I'm trying to figure that one out. But in the meantime, open to suggestions. I would really value them. I am particularly focused on the civics question at this moment in history because I have realized over the years that most schools don't even teach civics. Our young people don't understand the essential elements of a democracy or what it delivers to them. Um, and uh, and maybe in the spirit of giving young people hope, older people in my dreams taking on responsibility to teach that and to learn it would be valuable. I can say that there's an organization called Facing History, which actually I just have been reading their website because they've developed modules for teachers to teach about democracy. And I'm wondering if there might be a way to develop that for older adult volunteers who I'm confident could do the teaching if trained and lead the programs.
Very interesting, interesting thought. I'll have to revisit. Facing history has provided so many things, and
Mm.
there's unfortunately too many parallels, that come to mind in terms of Germany and here and other places in the world. So I think the idea of organizations like Facing History could be a really interesting thing in terms of teaching. And I'm not seeing people saying what roles people can have, but a lot of yes, yes, vote, vote, and our generation can provide a lot. I want to honor your time though too, and I know it's around one. So what what final? I'm so delighted, and I want to thank you so much for taking this time. And I
Thank
just
you.
wondered if there's some final kind of comment takeaway you'd like the listeners to have in addition to some of the wonderful gems that you've already provided.
Well, I think the challenge and mattering, which I learned a long time ago, is that the problems that confront us in general that we think mattering is important for, that need solving, are things that none of us can do solo. And we need to have ways for older adults to come together to take them on with skills in a carefully constructed, effective way, but not waiting for 20 years to figure it out. And how we come together, I think, is the critical issue ahead of us. And I would be delighted to have input from anyone on this call for suggestions. I designed Experience Core jointly with Mark Friedman many years ago now, 30 years ago, um, and learned a lot about how you create what is geekily described as collective efficacy, how we can be impactful together on things none of us can solve alone. And those tend to be the things that matter the most right now.
If
And
people wanted to reach you, well, you were going to say something else, but I also, before you leave, I want, if you can let people know if there's a way to reach you,
uh,
if they,
so you can read, I'll put my, if I can get into the chat. Oh, for some reason it's, okay. Here's my email. And happy to hear from you if you have suggestions.
so everybody, if you want to just take a moment to be able to note the email of Linda, or you can check in with me if you don't have that. But I just want to thank you so much for taking the time. I wish we had more time because you've been at this for so long, and I think that the way that you're able to combine the data and such thoughtful ideas that you have, as well as, what you've done over the years and programs there's such a richness. So I'm so delighted that you've started our 2026 out with thinking about these things. So I just want to thank you so much for being here and taking the time and all the wonderful hard work that you do. So
Well,
I see
thank
a
you.
lot
But
of
I will say we have a collective action problem where everybody's minds and actions are going to matter together. So hopefully this is an all-in proposition. Thank you. Thank you all
Thank
for
you.
being here. Take care.
Thanks. Take care. Stay well.